Oh, let me make sure you guys can see that. Probably can't, didn't share that screen. There we go. It's as if I haven't been doing Zoom for the last 100 million years. Okay, everybody can see that okay? Okay, great. So again, we're just going to give a brief overview here, and I'll be bantering, but Brenton and Rich should correct me if I say something wrong or I get sidetracked or what have you. The general plan here is just to run through this stuff quickly, and as a sort of again introductory contextual type of thing, as I hide my meeting controls here so I can see my screen. And there's plenty of time for questions after, but as I'm going through this, if something is not clear, but by all means, you guys are welcome to unmute and ask away. So this is our kickoff of our phase 2 of this project. This project really has grown out of a bunch of things that many of us here chatting today have worked on. But in particular, some of the most pressing issues that were coming up, including things like how we approach mitigation when we're not sure of the correct path, when we have a whole variety of constraints, how do we move forward? And there's just a recognition that particularly in the coastal zone where we have a lot of different ecosystems coming together, a lot of different user groups, a lot of different overlapping resources, how do we approach this in a way that's equitable and effective and promoting resilience? So as Amy mentioned earlier, this is a part of a series of projects that were aimed at helping inform policy and helping inform science needs across the state. And so this particular round, of which we were but one project that was funded, was to really address issues related to mitigation and restoring systems in the wake of an impact. And so we got a really slow launch of this. It was a pandemic and there was a bunch of crazy times, and then we had some other crazy things that have gone on. So we really have been hitting the ground only for about the last year and a half or so, but I think we're doing some good stuff. The context for this project overall is the recognition that we're seeing more and more, particularly in the coastal zone, more and more degradation of ecosystems, and indeed in some cases outright elimination. And it's a different world than the 70s or the 50s or the 60s. We just don't have as many options as we're going forward. As that's happening, the magnitude and the frequency of stressors are growing. And so we're going from things that might have been episodic or pulsed to in some cases being much more like a press disturbance, so a chronic stressor of many systems. With all that going on in the history of particularly things like coastal wetland restoration and mitigation, much of the low-hanging fruit across the coastal zone has already been snapped up, has already been engaged. And so as we go forward, there are fewer opportunities that are just completely obvious and sort of no-brainers. And so therefore, as we go forward into the future, the palette of what we might choose from are increasingly likely to be constrained. And while mitigation is only one tool, we think that it is, in addition to responding to direct impacts and degradation, we might also be able to use mitigation to helping boost equity and some of these other concerns that haven't traditionally been on the table when we talk about a traditional restoration for an impact. Our project has 3 phases, so we've finished phase 1 and we're on to phase 2. And phase 3 is essentially the synthesis. Phase 1 was basically conceptual, as I think you've all seen, a sort of mile-high view of what we would, how we think we might be able to improve mitigation, particularly out-of-kind mitigation. Phase 2, which is the one we're just about to enter, is the one we're actually going to try to put the rubber, where the rubber is going to meet the road, where we're going to work on some discrete case studies. So not sort of as much conceptual, theoretical, but more like how would we do this in situation X with constraints Y? And really try to run through some of these scenarios to both understand the strengths, but also some of the weaknesses of our current conceptualization and how we might be able to continue to revise and improve that.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So is phase two going to look at projects where this is currently a point of discussion, or is it like going back in time and redoing the compensatory mitigation, if you will, to see how it could have been done better? Does that make sense?
I think potentially we haven't picked one or the other. Our first example, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which are beaches, is a representative case, but a fake one, right? One that we're sort of synthesizing so parameterized by all real constraints that we've seen in other places, et cetera. But it's more of a what if type of scenario. We're not against going back and re-looking at old projects or historic stuff, but so far we're talking about just putting together new scenarios and running through those. Rich or Brenton might want to add something to that.
Yeah, I actually would be a little bit worried about going back and looking at old cases. The value is that it would be a real case with all the real complexity. The worry is that then we're like second guessing the agency that made the decisions and telling them you could have done it differently. And we don't, you'll hear elsewhere in the presentation, we're trying to make it clear that, we're trying to provide guidance about these issues, but we're not trying, oh, well, there it is, number 3. We're not trying to create policy, right? We're not trying to say what agencies should or shouldn't do, recognizing that every agency has different mandates and objectives and things like that. And so we're trying to provide something that is a broad enough framework that each agency can adopt it in a way that works for them. So that would be my concern about a real one, is that then we're like saying, well, this is what could have been done instead of what actually was done.
Thanks.
I'll just add too that for our goal for the phase 2 was with this beaches example that we'll chat about in a little bit, was to really kind of test this framework out in a way that, to provide an example that really kind of push the limits or boundary. That might not be the best way to do it, but it was to really have a good example to put our framework to the test, and I think kind of creating this hypothetical scenario will allow us to do that a little bit better.
Yeah, perfect. So to begin with, or not to begin with, but to continue with this conversation, I think it's important that we clarify our positions. And so it's been great, the feedback we've gotten. So sometimes we write reports and like 2 people read our reports and 2 people cite them and whatever. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about this, which is great. And so engaging, I think we've struck a nerve in some respects with this topic and everything, which is great. But I think it's important that we clarify where we're coming from. So even though we're focused on out of kind mitigation, we're not trying to, by any stretch of the imagination, say this is the only way to go forward, this is the only tool we should be using, or anything like that. And so for clarity, we too value healthy, well-functioning ecosystems, and we think that wherever we can, we want to prioritize in-kind mitigation. But we're doing this because, as we've experienced, we can't always do that, and so we don't have a lot of great guidance for when we can't do in-kind mitigation, how to go forward. So even though we're talking mostly about out of kind, we're not trying to say that in-kind doesn't matter or should be disregarded or anything like that. And related to that also, we're not trying to create an excuse by providing some kind of conceptual underpinning and a clarity around approaches to out-of-kind mitigation. We're not trying to provide an excuse for a responsible party that does have an impact to just simply get out and do something different or do something less challenging because we've created these guidelines or these ideas. And then, as Rich mentioned also, just to wrap up, we are trying to distill a lot of thinking and trying to pull together some helpful resources and frameworks and all of that. We would love it if these ideas can factor into some policy and procedures at different agencies, but we are not by any stretch of imagination telling different agencies what they should do. We're not trying to create policy for folks. We're trying to provide a resource from which that source material could be drawn upon to create policy if that is so desired by the agency. So we wanted to be clear about that. Okay, several key ideas here, and you know, we define these in our report, and we'll define these also when we get into our workshop. But just to be clear, a couple things for clarity. We're using the term coast in the broadest sense possible. So we're not using the Coastal Commission's definition of the coast or anything. We have a very generous interpretation of the coast. Basically, the land that's directly influenced by the sea, and the sea that's directly influenced by the land. So we're not using any sort of legal cutoff here or any specific habitat type only. We have a broad encompassing conceptualization when we talk about coastal restoration. Next, we're talking about compensatory mitigation here. And so the general approach to compensatory mitigation is we have some injury, some discrete injury, and we want to replace that, that resource that was lost, and indeed all of those resources that were lost. We've, as you'll see, or if you've read our report, we originally had a lot of different ideas and went down different pathways, but we centered on a couple key focus points for us, and one is ecological structure and function. And so that's more of the traditional stuff that we typically have talked about in the context of mitigation. So that would be the biotic and abiotic elements and processes, the vegetation, the reproduction of fish, and all that kind of good stuff. Ecosystem services, while we all you know, talk about them and laud them and talk about their value and importance, et cetera, they haven't always been a factor in many of our mitigation efforts. And so when we say ecosystem services, we are referring to direct and indirect benefits that humans derive from these healthy, well-functioning systems, from the structure and the function, et cetera. And then as a point of clarity here, again, we have both in-kind and out-of-kind mitigation. And it's been interesting, it's been particularly interesting as we've talked to different agency colleagues and read reports. Saying the term in-kind and out-of-kind is very easy to say. It's very interesting how diverse the interpretation of what is in and what is out, quote unquote, of kind is interpreted across different regions and different agencies and different sectors. But basically, in-kind is replacing the resource with something that is as close as possible to that resource that was originally there or that was harmed. Out-of-kind is replacing it with something else. So something that is different in some way, shape, or form from there. And the key here, particularly for all this stuff, but particularly when we get to out of kind, is this idea of equivalency factors and how we can take something that's not like and count that as you know, equivalent to something that's like. The general approach so we have so we have our in-kind stuff is across the top here, our out-of-kind is across the bottom. There's also an element here of on-site and off-site. That isn't really the particular focus of our efforts, and so we're really more concentrated on the out-of-kind. But I'll just say that, you know, we have dealt with both on and off-site mitigation traditionally with most of our traditional in-kind. And what we're hoping to do with this effort is to not replace that, or again, not to get rid of any of the top boxes, but to augment them, to give us other tools in our toolbox for managers and folks when they, a more complete picture here for our toolbox to respond to impacts. So in our phase one, we essentially, as I mentioned a minute ago, we essentially boiled it down to thinking about mitigation in terms of structure and function, and then ecosystem services. A key part that we articulated generally, but will definitely come up as we get, all this will come up as we get into our phase two. But in particular, this equivalency issue is how do we go about doing that equivalency? There's several ways, but three examples are here. One is we have a single metric, something like productivity or something like a single axis that you could evaluate equivalency. That's one approach, and there's inherently nothing necessarily wrong with that. Alternatively, we could use multiple metrics and have productivity and community benefit and this and that and a bunch of things together. And then another option is to do dollar equivalency. So the replacement cost or some other measure of that resource that's lost, we can convert that to dollars and then dollars to apply to that out of kind stuff. And there are others, but the point is there's many ways to go about that equivalency, and there's strengths and weaknesses of all of those approaches. Our general approach as we're thinking about this is to, when we go to out of kind, and we are working on how would we replace something, we want it to be as similar as possible. And so if we have just a generic articulation here where we have an axis of similarity, and on one side it's high similarity, on the other side it's low similarity, and on the other axis would be how much rigor do we need to bring to the work in the context of mitigation. And so something like a basic, so on this axis, it might go from a basic assessment that would be needed to give us confidence that this is a way forward. And then on the top of this axis would be a more complex approach needed to do the assessment and more rigorous types of approaches. And so as we go from high similarity with, say, a lost function, we wouldn't initially need a really rigorous or complex if it's quite similar to the resource that was lost. As the similarity gets less and less clear, as it becomes more vague and harder to figure out the equivalency, the need for complexity and the need for more additional rigor grows. And so that's the same whether it's ecological functioning or ecosystem services that would be impacted, that as things get less obvious, we need a greater weight of evidence, we need a greater rigor that's brought into what's going on here. Equivalency in the traditional in-kind sense is, well, I'll just say conceptually, equivalency might be similar to how we do it with in-kind. And how we've historically done that, or how we've sort of settled on in the last couple of years, is this notion of ratios, of offset ratios. So we might not be able to reproduce that resource exactly 100% to the level or the degree that it existed in a reference condition or before the impact, but the simple examples that we can get it half as good, the vegetation half as diverse, half as tall, half as whatever. And so therefore we would use a offset ratio of something like a 2-to-1, so that we would double the amount of benefit, so that in the net we would create the same level. That general approach is possibly applicable as well to out of kind, although we don't have much guidance for how to do that with out of kind as much. But that's what we're trying to do. We're really trying to figure out a way to bring equivalency analyses to these scenarios, so that we can have a higher degree of confidence that doing a particular out of kind action would lead to benefit. And so a lot of this is coming to, it's particularly when we talk about the coast wide in various different settings, kelp beds, coastal sage scrub, all these other things. It can be easy to get bogged down in some of the specifics of the particular systems, but in general, we think a weight of evidence approach is going to be the most helpful. So as we get into more distant relationships, more equivocal associations, the burden comes on to the proponents to have a greater weight of evidence, a greater a series of arguments that would convince us that this particular out-of-kind approach is a useful one to engage in. And so we try to summarize that in our phase 1 report, the draft 1 report. And so hopefully you guys all saw that, but these are examples. All this stuff was mentioned in there and gone over in there. So that's the setting. So we have this sort of conceptual approach, and we're trying to do better with out of kind, but we really want the rubber to meet the road. And so that's what we're doing in phase 2. And so we're trying to draw examples that are very real world, that have great utility for our various agency partners. And these are just a few, random recent headlines I grabbed. And here is one example. This is from last week. If it plays properly, yeah, maybe it plays properly. So this is Shell Beach. If I can make this bigger. So this is Shell Beach, and this is a new hardening of this person's property that's going on and is being constructed as we speak. There's also another house down the road, one of which is permitted, one of which is not permitted. Wow, look at that. That's a really exciting thing that we see there. So what we're doing in our phase 2 is to look at these issues with sandy beaches. Our goal with our phase 2 case studies and focal habitat areas is to be as specific as possible. And as Brenton mentioned earlier, we're trying to pick stuff that is, also, contentious and not everybody agrees on, so we can sort of push this and see where the limits are, where the strengths and the weaknesses are. We also really like to get some ideas of different types of approaches, different ways someone might approach out of kind mitigation in a particular sense. These strengths and weaknesses that we find will both help us revise our thinking in general, but also the overall guidance in the overall phase 1 report, which will be adapted and updated as we go forward. So what we're doing is sandy beaches. Sandy beaches is our target. And so we've worked fairly hard to try to pick something that is very realistic, very real world, but the specifics are made up. The specific stress or the specific impacts are made up at this particular site. And so we're going to look at a sandy beach, a loss of sandy beach in coastal Malibu with cliff back beaches and constrained areas. And the short version is someone illegally puts a groin up, illegally puts up some hardened structures that impacts the sand arriving onto the beach. And so we'll go from there. So having said this, just like we clarified our positions at the start, we also want to clarify that we like sandy beaches. We don't hate sandy beaches. We're not anti-sandy beach or anything like that. We want to see more beaches and protect our beaches that exist. And so we're not trying to provide, again, some sort of get out of jail free card for someone having an impact on any of our sandy beach ecosystems. They're valuable. They're important. We all work on them and study them. But this is again a test for what we want to do. We think that this particular scenario that we've crafted is really representative of both the situations that we're seeing in particular along the California coast, but also is representative of what we see coming down the pike with things like sea level rise, complications, and other things of that nature. So as we talk about this, and as we get into our in-person activity in the coming weeks, we really want everybody to try to approach this with a really open mind. And we want to hear the weaknesses, we want to hear the concerns, but we get it that everybody has their favorite thing, and everybody has their champion organism and habitat and all that kind of good stuff. But we really are trying to get everybody to go out of their comfort zone and see what we would tolerate and what's acceptable, and how can we be assured that these resources are being protected, even if that particular form or particular function might be replaced with something else. when we come together in person, we welcome insights from everybody, but we also want to acknowledge very clearly that this is a working group, right? This is an effort of experts coming together to kick around some ideas and to come up with some scenarios and some solutions and some notions. We totally appreciate that any agency participating here are not. I mean, while they're representing the views of their agency, they are not creating policy for their agency, and they're not, necessarily endorsing anything that comes out of here. So we want to be as inclusive as possible and invite everybody in, but we're not trying to get anybody in trouble or trying to get anybody to say that, person X from agency Y said this. It's more about pulling together the best thoughts, pulling together the what ifs, and all that kind of good stuff. Before we publish anything officially out to everyone else, we will also seek your permission to ask if we can include you as a workshop member, as a co-creator. And some of you may well wish to do that, which we love it. We'd invite everybody that's participated in any way, shape, or form to have your name attached to this. But we also understand that for various reasons that may not be desirous by some folks. So no one is going to be no one's going to be outed for participating with us. That's not the idea here. We're not trying to get anybody in trouble with their executive directors or whomever. So we'd love for you guys to participate. Everybody's welcome, but no one is forced to agree to whatever comes out of here. What we're going to actually do is we're going to meet in person for 2 days. We've tried various things. It's a different world after the pandemic to get folks together in working groups and stuff, and everybody's busy and it's really hard to schedule stuff. So the idea is we're going to come together for 2 days to engage with this case study, with this loss of Sandy Beach case study that we've crafted. But the goal is that's it, right? Is to have this 2 days and to be really focused and working for those whole 2 days, but then you guys would not have any homework, right? This is not for you to create stuff for you to go do for 2 months afterwards. We would love for your feedback of the products that Rich and Brenton and I will clean up and tighten up and all that kind of stuff. But you do not need to worry about committing to weeks and weeks worth of work, et cetera, afterwards. We're really trying to get the work done in this 2-day period, which is why we want to come together and be in community with everybody in the same physical space. That will, though, also mean that for these, some of the preliminary documents, like the draft scenario, we really expect you guys to read those ahead of time and to look through them ahead of time so that we can hit the ground running on. We will have a little bit of orientation at the start of the workshop, but the idea is to really hit the ground running and just get into the meat of the writing and the thinking and the pluses and minuses in a fun way. And I think this stuff's fun. I hope you guys think this is fun. But that's our plan. We were soliciting a couple different dates. It's looking like the February 6th and 7th is pretty much the one that is more popular amongst folks. So that's going to be a 2-day thing. We have money to put you guys up in hotels and all that kind of stuff, help with transportation, pay for food, all that good stuff. And it'll be in Oxnard. The location will be at our Cal State Channel Islands Boating Center in Oxnard, California. So if you're blocking out your calendar, we'll start early on the 6th and we'll go to, late afternoon on the 7th. So if somebody's flying in, you could catch an evening flight, but we really want to have 2, solid full days of collaboration and chatting and getting into the details of that. And with that, I just want to say on behalf of my colleagues, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for everybody that's helped us so far and given us feedback and participated in previous parts. We're looking forward to seeing you all in a few weeks and to really getting into this in depth. But with that, that's our formal thing, unless Brenton or Rich wants to add anything else before we kill the recording.
Nope, nothing to add for me.
Okay. All right, perfect. So there we go. So that's our formal presentation. I'll kill